Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a cloud solutions architect specializing in management technologies. Today's session will be a focus on co-management, but it will be a little bit different than the sessions I normally do. We're not going to leave PowerPoint for this session, and this is upfront not a co-management session, meaning I'm not going to talk to you about how to configure co-management. I'm done that in other sessions. If you want a session on how to build out co-management and so on, then take a look at those sessions which are available. But instead, this session is going to be focused on making the right choice when it comes to implementing co-management, right? In the co-management world, it means that you have two management tools, ConfigMgr and Intune, and each tool can be responsible for a certain type of configuration workload, right? And deciding which tool owns responsibility for that workload is an important thing, and that's what we're going to get into. All right, pretty simple agenda for this discussion. We're going to go over some general concepts just to kind of get started. Then we're going to go review the workloads that you can use in a co-management scenario. Then we'll make some recommendations, and we will be done with the session. So to get started on the general side of things, right? Just a couple of concepts, a couple of questions, I suppose. So the first question might be, Intune only. Do we need co-management at all? I guess I could also put up here a question, ConfigMgr only, right? And what I think about in this mindset is customers who maybe are not currently using Microsoft as a management platform. And I'm thinking of a couple of customers that are transitioning to Microsoft management from a third-party management solution right now. And so they uniquely will have the decision, do I use Intune by itself? Do I use ConfigMgr by itself? Do I use ConfigMgr and Intune together? And really, for customers who are transitioning over fresh to a Microsoft management solution, yeah, technically there's the question, do I use ConfigMgr by itself? But really, that's really not the main question, right? Because in our modern world, ConfigMgr is an on-prem solution. And so the idea of setting up an on-prem management solution probably isn't top of mind for most organizations, and nor should it be, right? Intune, though, being a cloud service, if you can get what you need out of Intune, then it is a fantastic management platform and will do a tremendous amount of what you need, maybe entirely what you need. And where there are things that you might want to do differently, there's ways to even do that, right? So I'm not going to dig into that. But bottom line, if you can do Intune all by itself, then absolutely do that. Intune is great. Having a single tool is great, right? And so don't be nervous at all about an Intune only solution. I know of many organizations who have only Intune. They're able to do management very, very, very effectively for Windows, for the other platforms that Intune supports, no issue at all. But for many of the customers who are approaching Intune, they have already ConfigMgr in place in their environment. And so they have built business processes around some of the things that ConfigMgr will give to them. And some of those things, Intune really doesn't have an equivalent. We'll talk about some of those in a minute. And so the idea of co-management is absolutely a fantastic idea for them. So just to be clear up front, you probably know this, but just to say it, right? Co-management is a scenario that is a Windows-only scenario, meaning if we're talking about other platforms that Intune supports, iOS, Android, Mac, Linux, whatever, the concept of co-management does not apply. Co-management only applies to Windows because only Windows can receive management from ConfigMgr and from Intune. ConfigMgr doesn't support any platforms outside of Windows, right? For that, so that's the reason. And when you think about co-management, the way that I tend to think about co-management is you have config manager on one side, you have Intune on the other. I kind of analogize those to two different tool belts, right? They are different tool belts. They have different tools in each tool belt. Some of the tools may be very similar. They may look almost identical, right? But each tool has its own unique set. Each tool belt has its own unique set of tools. If you have Config Manager and Intune together, then you can pull the right tool out of its respective tool belt for the job that you need to do. And sometimes the Config Manager tool belt will give you a better tool. Sometimes the Intune tool belt will give you a better tool. Sometimes there's only one tool belt that has a tool that will work for the job, right? And so we'll spend some time kind of talking about some of those to give you an idea, right? So the other thing that I have heard since Intune was introduced, right? I've heard various discussions, questions, comments about Config Manager. Does Config Manager have any plans for deprecation? Is it still a solid product that Microsoft believes in, supports, invests in, whatever? And the answer is that there is no, as far as I know, and I've asked the question around many times, there is no plan to deprecate Config Manager. It is true to say that Intune is being developed at a very rapid pace, and probably fair to say Intune is the focus for our management tools today. But there are customers that depend on Config Manager. There's customers that, small set, right, in unique scenarios, but there are customers that cannot use anything besides Config Manager to manage their devices. So for those reasons and others, there's no plan to deprecate Config Manager. I've been party to conversations, sadly, with even some of our own Microsoft salespeople that have kind of put that idea out there that Config Manager is going to be deprecated. It's just not true, right? So don't be nervous about the idea of using Config Manager. If it benefits you, absolutely use it, right? But the idea of Config Manager only these days is not where you generally want to be at all. So I would tell most customers, again, there are those customers that are in unique scenarios that it's not that they don't want to use Intune, they can't use Intune. It's just technically not possible, right? For those customers, yeah, go use Config Manager, keep using Config Manager, no problem at all. For customers who do have the ability to add Intune on top of Config Manager or in parallel with Config Manager, if you haven't done that, if you're not planning to do that, then frankly, you're making a mistake, right? There's no reason at all to not be looking toward Intune and coupling that with your config manager environment and so on, right? So enough about that, right? So what I want to do here is kind of go through, you see this table, right? So sometimes people say, well, why do I still need config manager, right? What are the advantages of still having config manager? And there are some, right? There are some things that config manager will do that Intune just doesn't do the same, right? So off the top of my head, I put this together and want to kind of get you thinking about those things here. And so we'll start with inventory, both hardware and software inventory. Intune absolutely will do inventory, but it is nowhere as good at the granularity of inventory as config manager is. There's organizations who've built business processes around the ability to do very granular, very detailed, very customized inventory, right? And so you build collections on that, target baselines and different configuration items and so on based on what they find in hardware inventory. So for those customers that have business processes built around inventory, you need to keep config manager. Intune just doesn't have that capability, right? So that's one. And I'm not going to I might be tempted to geek out and try to dig deeper in all these. I'll try to avoid that because that's not really the point, pardon me, of this session. But another one, right, is task sequencing. So organizations who have used task sequences for years to very effectively image their devices, to very effectively control the order of operations of different deployments, even outside of imaging. There is no equivalent for task sequencing in Intune. In fact, one area that I see a lot of customers blend the config manager and Intune capabilities uh, in to achieve their goals is autopilot, right? Autopilot, a number of different ways you can implement that. You can be a pretty simple implementation with everything kind of driven out of Intune. That's cool, but there can be some scenarios where you need the granularity, the focus, the uh, flexibility of config manager as a part of autopilot. So being able to take autopilot and install the config manager client as part of it and launch a task sequence along with autopilot and let that task sequence do some of the heavy lifting that maybe you've built processes around, that's absolutely a scenario that can work, right? And again, more details as to how that would be done. Autopilot itself is a massive topic. Autopilot itself is one that I've done a video on, so go find that if you want to know. But that's certainly one where, autopilot's the cool modern way to do imaging. Task sequencing, though, does not go away, right? That doesn't have to go away. If you like what you can do with task sequencing, which most people who use task sequencing do, right, then you can leverage that in a autopilot world, in an Intune config manager co-managed world, right? No problem. You can still leverage, all of that. And the implications outside of imaging, with just again software distribution and controlling order of operations, it all still is available to you. Configuration baselines, configuration items. So yes, Intune has a similar ability to do this. It's not the same, but it can achieve similar results. In Config Manager, we have this expansive configuration baseline, configuration item capability that includes being able to do really easy checks and querying of the registry and WMI and SQL queries and all these things, and including script, right? Intune, the equivalent of Intune is called proactive remediations. And there, the only option you have is to build a PowerShell script. But it can achieve the same result, right? So, again, similar tools, but different, right? And if you built a lot of structure around configuration items, configuration baselines, there's reasons to keep those items in Config Manager. We'll talk about one in a minute. As we go down the list, so software metering. You might have some processes built around software metering. There is no equivalent of software metering in Intune. Reporting, big deal in Config Manager. And that's not to say we don't have reporting in Intune. We do, but it's a different approach to reporting, right? It's a different skill set, if you will, to reporting in Intune. So we'll just leave that one there. So collections, right? So the equivalent of collections in the modern world is Azure AD groups. This isn't even an Intune theme, right? Intune leverages Azure AD groups as in the same way Config Manager leverages collections. And Azure AD groups generally are fine. But here's the reality. Azure AD groups are nowhere near as flexible as Config Manager collections. And so there is the ability in Config Manager to have collections replicated to Azure AD. I should actually clean that up. The membership of collections replicated into Azure AD groups, where Config Manager drives that process. So if you have a collection that you've built, and there's nothing you can't build. Collections can be built from virtually unlimited uh, types of data, right? So there's nothing you can't build a collection if you need to achieve your goals, right? You may find frustration trying to build the equivalent in Azure AD groups, and so if you build your collection and you want to leverage that granularity of Config Manager and replicate the membership of the collection into Azure AD groups, Config Manager does that for you automatically, keeps things in sync. It's a pretty slick process, right? Orchestration groups. Uh, if you're using Config Manager to deliver software updates, you may be using orchestration groups to help uh, streamline that process, refine that process, make it more aligned with your business requirements, and so on. There is no equivalent in Intune. Uh, Software updates themselves, right? Yeah, you can do software updates with both Intune and Config Manager. The difference is that with Config Manager, you have the ability to do very granular control of when software updates go, how they go, when they get downloaded, and so on. And kind of going right along with that, the maintenance windows that you can put in place largely for servers. Server management isn't part of Intune anyway. Little asterisks there. We'll talk about one aspect of that coming up. But very easy implementation of maintenance windows. You have the ability to do very granular control of rebooting in Config Manager. There's in terms of deployments of whatever you want, whether it's a Win32 app, MSI, doesn't matter, right? You can really tightly control how that happens with Config Manager deployments, right? Whereas in Intune, you can still deploy the same things, but it's not as much of a control that you have over when things roll, right? So that's just a few. There's Community Hub, right? More. That's some of the stuff that comes to mind as I try to think about what Config Manager can do that Intune can't do as or in the same way, or maybe even as well in some cases, right? But then there's certain things that Intune does amazingly well, right? That Config Manager either can't do or doesn't do as well as Intune. So Intune truly cross-platform. We're talking about Windows because of co-management, but Intune is Windows and iOS and Android and Linux and Mac, right? All of them. Very cross-platform solution. There's capabilities in Intune that we're not going to have in Config Manager, such as endpoint privilege management. Again, not going to get granular on what these things are, but endpoint privilege management is something introduced into Intune. It's really cool. It is that next level of granularity for control of the users on devices. Run as admin has been an option for years. This tightens that down and helps you get even better with the principle of least privilege and still letting users do what they need to do. Enough about that, right? But that's one thing in Intune. Remote help. So certainly Config Manager has remote control. Customers have used it for years. But in Config Manager, remote control is limited to on-prem devices, right? You have the cloud management gateway to keep connected with computers that are remote, off-site, right? But remote control doesn't work through a cloud management gateway. Remote help works, doesn't matter where the machine is, right? So that's another similar functionality, but better perhaps in Intune. Windows Update for Business is Intune's solution for, or Intune leverages Windows Update for Business for deploying software updates. Don't discount this, right? Windows Update for Business is an excellent solution. It is Windows 10 and Windows 11 only, right? If we would have had this conversation a few years ago, I would have steered you away from Windows Update for Business. It wasn't ready for prime time. Now it is. It's different than what you do with software update deployment in Config Manager, but absolutely worth consideration. Along with that, auto patch. I can just imagine, organizations that are out there every single month, spending cycles dealing with patching of their Windows devices. Auto patch is a tool that takes over and makes this an automatic thing that you don't have to worry about like you do today, right? So AutoPatch, if you haven't looked at it, take a look. This is a really cool ability that Intune offers you through Windows Update for Business to be able to really decrease the administrative effort that you have to do patching. Right? May not be for you yet, but at least you need to be aware of it. Group policy analytics. So every organization, as they think about getting into a modern approach to things, will at some point grapple with, what do I do about my group policy settings? So that's a very good discussion to have, right? Group policy, if you have it implemented through your on-prem AD domain, then guess what? Your devices need to be joined to that on-prem domain in order to receive group policy. Workstations won't, when those devices are off the network, they won't receive group policy settings, whatever, right? Intune, it doesn't matter whether you're hybrid Azure AD joined, whether you're pure Azure AD joined, whether you're whatever configuration, you can deploy, if the device, say it this way, if the device can be enrolled in Intune, you can deploy settings to that device and manage your historical group policy settings now through Intune. So group policy analytics is that piece that allows you to evaluate, hey, here's what my group policies are today. What is the equivalent in Intune? How do I migrate those settings to equivalent settings in Intune? So that's a unique Intune thing. Configuration profiles and compliance policy. These are two items that in any co-managed configuration, these are the two workloads that generally go first to be shifted to Intune. We'll talk about those more in a minute. Why? Because in the scale of what ConfigMgr does well and what Intune does well, for Intune, these two are things that Intune excels at doing. Again, not to say you can't do it with ConfigMgr. You can, but Intune is better, frankly, than ConfigMgr. Then we have, these aren't really co-management things. I just put them on here because I thought about them. App protection policies, app configuration profiles. These are unique Intune capabilities. They're targeted to iOS and Android, so I won't go any further into them here. But just to call them out, security baselines. Here's a similar capability between ConfigMgr and Intune, but Intune I think has an edge a bit on ConfigMgr. There's security task with MDE integration that does some really cool things, which we'll talk about more in a minute. There's Microsoft Tunnel Gateway. We could go on and include more probably in this list as well. But I wanted to give you that and help kind of equip you if you do have a conversation. Well, ConfigMgr and Intune are the same. Well, they're not. They're not at all. They're similar, right? There are similarities, but there are definite differences between the two, right? Okay. So now let's get into some of the co-management workloads. So this is a diagram that I pulled, and I'm not going to go into the diagram. You can look at it, but the idea is here's a Windows device, and it is enabled for co-management. We're going to have some of the management coming from our on-prem ConfigMgr environment over here, and then part of the management is coming from Intune, right? That's basically what it's trying to show. All right, so in terms of workloads, right, when we think about co-management, we think about workloads. What workload is going to be owned by ConfigMgr? What workload is going to be owned by Intune? Well, when you first enable co-management, every workload is owned by ConfigMgr, right? You have to make the choice to shift a workload to be managed by Intune, right? And that's just a natural progression. So as you think about the workloads that are available, that's where we want to kind of dig deeper and see what the recommendations maybe are for those workloads and so on. The other concept that we want to think about is who is the management authority for the workload. This goes right hand in hand with who owns the workload, right? who owns the workload, who is the management authority for the workload. It's either ConfigMgr or Intune. And so the normal concept of shifting a workload is if ConfigMgr owns the workload, then ConfigMgr is the only management platform that can actually do something related to that workload. In parallel, then the concept is if you shift the workload to Intune, then Intune is the management authority. So Intune is the only tool that can actually do something with that workload. That's true, but it's kind of not true at the same time, right? So we'll dig into each one of those in a minute, right? So an example is compliance. You're going to see that on the next slide. If you shift compliance to Intune, then Intune is the only management tool that is going to be able to work with compliance, right? Yes, that is a correct statement, but it's a correct statement that also is an incorrect statement, right? And so let me just move ahead and show you what I'm talking about, right? So this is the compliance workload. So, and all of these are going to have, this is just a screenshot from my ConfigMgr environment that I put up here for reference. All of these are going to show workload shifted to ConfigMgr. What I mean when I say, if you shift this over to Intune, Intune is going to be the management authority for compliance. Intune is going to be the only tool that has responsibility, key phrase, has responsibility for compliance on that Windows device. But uniquely, with compliance, you can tell Intune, hey, yeah, you own compliance. That's awesome. You take responsibility for that. But as you assess compliance, ask ConfigMgr what it thinks too. Right? That's this little highlight down here. Now, you don't have to do that, but it is an option for you. So now that you have that option to ask ConfigMgr, you can see all of the different things that Intune can do or factor in when it's assessing compliance. When you tell it, factor ConfigMgr into compliance, then that world explodes as to options that you can then evaluate for compliance. When you tell Intune to factor ConfigMgr in, then we're going to go over, Intune's going to go over to ConfigMgr, and any configuration item / baseline combination that is flagged as a compliance baseline will be factored into the compliance assessment. It really gives you the best of both worlds. And so truthfully, in this case, compliance owned by Intune, but ConfigMgr still can have a seat at the table, if you will, right? And again, that's what I mean by it depends on the workload, right? So what are the impacts of shifting the workload? Well, Intune owns compliance, and compliance will be configured or factored in based on what you set. If you let ConfigMgr be queried, we're going to ask for that. Compliance will be reflected to Azure AD in a very seamless, straightforward way so that you can factor that into things like conditional access, right? So on. So Intune does really well with compliance. It is the better tool, frankly, for compliance. So the recommendation here is shift compliance policies to Intune. This is typically the first workload that moves over to Intune, right? So that's compliance. Let's keep going. Now, what about device configuration? So I mentioned how this works depends on the workload being moved or being considered, right? And here's an example of that. So also, this is a snapshot. Under device configuration, you're going to have two other things. You're going to have, kind of a subcategories, endpoint protection, get to that one in a minute. Resource access, get to that one in a minute, right? So these device configuration and endpoint protection and resource access kind of in some ways are tied together, in some ways they're separate. But here, we're going to focus on device configuration. So in terms of device configuration, this is going to be a workload that defines the rules and the settings for devices across different settings categories. It is possible to use Config Manager for this, but it's better to use Intune. Here, with device configuration, one thing that's key right from the beginning, after the workload is shifted to Intune, it is still possible to deploy settings from Config Manager to co-managed devices. Why? Because there may be, probably are, gap is closing, settings that you have implemented in Config Manager that aren't yet available in Intune, or maybe you haven't built them in Intune yet, whatever, right? So the ability to let Intune own the workload, but still Config Manager can implement certain settings on that device or certain configurations on that device. That's a really, really good combination. So just a few notes here about how this works that I won't necessarily read to you, but for reference about how this is implemented, some of the caveats and so on. I just took these from the documentation, but I think they're important, right? And so the general recommendation here would be let Intune own this particular workload, right? This is the second one that is typically shifted to Intune, right? Because Intune, frankly, is better suited for this, and with the ability to not lose the ability to manage from Config Manager where you need to, it just kind of makes sense, right? And that's what I mean. You're already starting to see. That's what I mean. Just in these two, if you shift compliance, Intune fully owns compliance, and it won't. Config Manager can't do anything directly with compliance. Intune owning compliance, you can ask Config Manager, but Intune still owns compliance. Here, shifting configuration of the device to Intune, you can still, Intune is not going to directly ask Config Manager at that stage, but it's also not going to block Config Manager. So you're starting to see some of the subtle differences on some of these workloads and why we need to understand them. Now, one other thing that I will point out. So if you shift the configuration workload, then you're going to be shifting the workload um, uh, for endpoint protection and for resource access at that time. So you can't move the configuration slider as you see here without moving those sliders for endpoint protection and resource access, as well, right? But you can actually leave device configuration over with Config Manager and move endpoint protection independently. So when you move endpoint protection, that's going to allow Intune to take the lead for things like antivirus and firewall and device control and application guard and all of these things that are part of the Defender suite, right? Intune will take the lead on. And there's actually some interesting things here, right? So if you shift the workload to Intune and there are existing configuration manager configurations delivered to that device, then Config Manager delivered configurations will remain in force until there's something from Intune that comes down and overwrites that, right? We don't want to leave the device unprotected. So that's important. The other thing is when you have Intune kind of working with the endpoint protection stuff, that includes MDE integration, that's all of these things, right? This is the first place, I said earlier, that Intune cannot manage servers. It can't, right? But endpoint protection in certain areas, and that area, number of areas is growing, right? In certain areas, if you go to like antivirus or firewall, or can't remember the other areas off the top of my head, and you create a profile, you'll see an option to say Windows 10/11. You'll also see an option right under that, Windows 10/11, Windows Server. But wait, Steve, you just said Intune can't manage Windows servers. That's true, it can't. But uniquely on endpoint protection, whenever you have your servers enrolled in MDE, there is a linkage between endpoint protection through Intune and MDE on the back end so that you effectively can build in Intune a configuration for servers and workstations. And when Intune sees servers, it will say, oh, that's something I can't do, but MDE can. And so I'm going to shuttle that off to MDE and let MDE implement that on the servers that are also enrolled in MDE, right? There's a lot of detail there, and that's as much as I'll say here, but it is a really cool capability that is best done through Intune. There's some other notes here as well that you can read. I won't belabor the point, but again, the recommendation here is shift the workload to Intune. Not that you can't do it with ConfigMgr. You can. There's actually a couple of subtle differences on some of these things on how you do it with ConfigMgr and Intune. But just with the integration story with MDE by itself, that is enough. I would say recommend moving this workload to Intune anyway, even without MDE. But with the MDE integration, it makes much more sense to let Intune have control of this workload if you're using endpoint protection, right? The next workload, resource access. So this one is deprecated as of ConfigMgr 2203. So if you're on 2203 or better, this workload, it doesn't matter. What you have configured here, we've deprecated. You can only do these things through Intune, so I'm not going to spend any time at all on it. Then the next workload, client apps. So this is a capability that basically will give you a list of apps that you might want on the device. Here, now, if you deploy something as required, then having the user see a list of apps, it really doesn't matter, right, that much. But in a world where maybe you are deploying things, a catalog of apps, maybe things that you want the user to be able to install optionally, whatever, then that does matter. And so client apps is another one of those workflows that if you shift it to Intune, then Intune will own it, but it does not prevent ConfigMgr from being effective at deploying to that co-managed device, right? So you could shift the workload to Intune and still, for those configurations, like maybe a deployment of a task sequence that installs software or whatever, for those things that you want to leverage ConfigMgr to do, you can still do them with ConfigMgr. But the things that Intune is better at, like maybe the updated approach to the Windows Store, only Intune can tap into that capability. Then you can have Intune do that, and it's seamless to the user. On the back end, you have a choice of which tool you use to do a given thing, but to the user, could be seamless to the user. What do I mean could be? Because in ConfigMgr, whenever we're deploying apps, those apps show up in Software Center, right? In Intune, when we're deploying apps, optional apps, where the user can interact, that user interactions happens through Company Portal. Having two portals that a user has to worry about generally is probably not a preferred thing. And so I show in client settings through ConfigMgr how you can decide the user portal that ConfigMgr will use. By default, it's Software Center. But you can say, even ConfigMgr, no, use Company Portal. So whenever, regardless of the tool, whether it's ConfigMgr or Intune, whenever the apps are published to the user, they can access them in a common portal. That's generally perceived as probably a better approach. So the recommendation here would be shift this to Intune, because you don't lose any functionality. You just gain functionality by moving this workload. Okay, keeping on. Right now, Office click to run apps and that workload. So this one is one that's it's good to move, and it's up to you whether you move it. I mean, it describes how or where these click to run apps are going to show up and how they'll show up and so forth, and it's fine, right? This is one that, to me anyway, and it may be different for you, but to me, this is not a high priority item to move. And when I think of that, I think of the fact that Office itself has ways to manage its own software on your devices. Historically, the updates for Office were better served through ConfigMgr, but now with some of the recent updates, the Office team is recommending that you use Office itself for the updating process. So, move it if it fits your needs. But this is not one that I would prioritize over the other ones. It's certainly fine to move, and you can see some of the notes about this particular workload, but probably one of the last ones that I would consider. But it depends on you and what your particular needs are, right? So we'll just move on from there. And the last workload that we'll talk about is Windows Update. We've talked about that a little bit. Windows updates, it totally depends on how you deploy Windows updates. When you move the Windows Update workload to Intune, then the Windows Update workload in ConfigMgr should be disabled, right? There are some, again, there are configurations here that there's some detail that I'm not going to get into. I've seen customers, for example, use one tool for Windows feature updates and another tool for version updates or whatever, right? So some nuance there. But the real decision is, are you ready to let Intune own your Windows 10, Windows 11 updating? If you are, then it is absolutely a beautiful thing to let Windows Update for Business drive that experience. It's going to be less work, generally, is the feedback you hear, compared to software updates in ConfigMgr. But it's up to you, right? This is one of those that it just truly depends on your business model. Fine to move it, fine to not, right? Generally, this is one of the last ones to move. If you can, cool. If not, then cool, right? So that kind of runs through the workloads. And I just am struck as I have gone through this that virtually every workload that is possible to move, I've recommended move it to Intune. The exceptions being Office 365 apps, move it if you need to, and Windows Update, move it if you need to. Which would maybe make you ask the question, well, if we're moving these workloads to Intune, why do we need ConfigMgr? And the answer goes back to the beginning of this discussion, right? Just because we're moving some workloads does not mean that ConfigMgr is not active on these machines and pulling data and detail that are critical to you in other areas of your business to do things like granular inventory, building collections and replicating those to Azure AD and task sequencing and all of these different things, right? Moving the workloads is how you implement co-management, but it is not the full descriptor of what ConfigMgr will do on a device, what Intune will do on a device. It's part of the story, right? So that's the tip I will leave you with. That's really, I don't have, this is just basically a rehash of the agenda, I realize, but that's what I wanted to leave you with here, right? And the other thing I'll leave you with is with co-management. I hope a takeaway from here is that you realize it's not just simply a matter of, oh, we're shifting the workload, now Intune owns it, now we, whatever. You need to understand the implications of shifting the workload, what it really means to shift a workload, what it really means, does Intune own this, does ConfigMgr own this, and so on. It's not the same in every case. And the difference that you might experience is hopefully clear right now. So with that, we will end this session. I appreciate you hanging out, and we will see you next